Mortgages. Nobody loves them, except for lenders. But what happens to the housing market when interest rates spike and mortgage rates rise sharply? I'll dig into the data to answer this question, and the results might just surprise you in this episode of The Lead. Alright, so in order to analyze this question, we're going to need data on two things. First, we need a timeline of every interest rate tightening cycle in recent history, and second, we need historical data to analyze what happened to the market as a result. Now, it's pretty easy to find a timeline of every recession floating around the internet, but tightening cycles, they're a different thing altogether. So it was a bit of a tedious job, but I manually cobbled together a dataset of every tightening cycle in recent history, and the end result was a list of 16 historical tightening cycles dating back to the 1980s, including the most recent tightening cycle we're still living through at the time of shooting this video. Alright, so now that we've got our list of tightening cycles, we still need to pull in the market data to analyze what happened in response to each cycle. But to do that, we're going to need to transform the data a little bit so that we can compare the historical impacts to one another on a common basis. One way economists typically do this is by indexing the data to an initial value so that each successive value represents the change relative to that initial value. In this case, I've converted the index value to percentage changes so that it's a little more intuitive to follow. So let's pull up a chart and see what happened to home sales in Greater Vancouver 36 months after the start of each tightening cycle. Now this is going to be a fairly technical chart, so let me walk us through what we're going to be looking at step by step. Looking at the left side of this chart, we're measuring the change in home sales relative to the number of home sales at the beginning of each tightening cycle. And along the bottom of this chart, we're measuring 36 months from the start of each tightening cycle. I've also included a dashed line at the 0 mark because this line will help us to see if sales were higher or lower than they started at in each of the 36 months following the start of each tightening cycle. So let me bring in some data to help illustrate this picture a little more clearly. So each of the home sales data series I've pulled in here is labeled along the right-hand side by the years associated with the tightening cycle. And if we focus in on the big picture, we can see that not every single data series goes below the 0 line on the chart. And what this means is that not every tightening cycle had an immediately negative impact on sales. So that's pretty interesting. But what about the impact of the current tightening cycle? Well, we can bring in the latest data series and we can see that the current tightening cycle has sales down pretty hard relative to previous cycles. In fact, the current cycle is actually the worst on record so far, even beating out some of the notorious cycles of the early 1980s when interest rates were soaring above 20%. Now, the big question is what's likely to happen going forward from here? Well, it's always hard to predict the future with certainty, but we've got some historical perspective here we can turn to. And if we search in this chart for a historical analog to the current situation, we might point to a cycle like the 1980-81 cycle. So, I'll get rid of the other lines in this chart, and I'll just highlight the current cycle versus the 1980-81 cycle. And if we look at the chart now, we can see that in the 1980-81 cycle, sales had fully recovered from a little over a 50% decline in about 24 months. And given that we're about 12 months into the current cycle, if our market were to follow this path, it might be possible to see sales back at pre-cycle levels in a little over 12 months from now. But that's a purely hypothetical situation, and anything can happen. What about prices? Do rate hikes always translate to lower home values? Well, just like we did for sales, we can make a similar chart for prices. Here's a plot of what that looks like. Now, this chart might surprise some people. It certainly surprised me when I first made it. I would have expected to see a greater number of tightening cycles resulting in meaningful declines in home prices across Greater Vancouver. But looking at the big picture, we can see that there were actually quite a few tightening cycles associated with price increases in our market. It was only the 1981 and 82 cycles that brought prices down by more than 10%, with the 81 cycle taking prices down over 25% by about 18 months into it. And if we bring in the latest data, we can see that so far, the current cycle doesn't seem to be tracking the 1981 cycle too closely. If anything, it looks to be tracking the 1982 cycle, which brought prices down a little over 10% in roughly 8 months, but had prices nearly back to pre-cycle levels in about 18 months. So, again, purely hypothetically speaking, if the present cycle were to track the 1982 cycle, as it seems to be doing so far, it might be possible to see prices near pre-cycle levels in a little over 6 months from now. But like I always say, anything can happen. So there you have it. Every tightening cycle in recent history and the impact on the greater Vancouver housing market, all in under 6 minutes. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for future episodes of The Lead.